Thank you, Tony. In recent months, the historic sanctuary of Capitol Park has been deeply marred by excavation equipment, cranes and scaffolding, and its serenity broken by the heavy thud of falling tree limbs as century-old heritage trees succumb to the contractor's chainsaws. This activity followed the regretful razing of the East Annex in July 2023. The annex, built in 1952, housed the offices of the governor, the lieutenant governor, legislators, and state officials, the historic personages whose leadership propelled them to national prominence. Within those halls included one governor who built the annex, Earl Warren, who became the U.S. Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and one governor who built the annex, and one governor who became president, Ronald Reagan. The public officials who dismissed pleas for restoration and instead authorized bulldozing of that landmark structure did so in utter disregard of the historic significance of the annex, those folks who occupied that office. With the East Annex now demolished, our 5-year battle to preserve and restore the symbol of California's democracy has shifted to Capitol's West Plaza at the risk of suffering a similar fate. In April, we won an injunction that will block demolition of the West Front, and I said at least temporarily, but now we find out that the legislature doesn't like the 2 judgments of the 3rd District Court of Appeal. So what did they do yesterday? They introduced legislation to do away with the CEQA. This is something that you'll find out has been going on for years. In 1982, California elected officials, Sacramento civic and business leaders, and citizens celebrated completion of a 7-year project to fully restore the state capitol building, even more than a century-year-old. The restoration of the magnificent building we are again fighting to protect was a testament to the triumph of architectural presence. Oh, great. Thank you. It was a testament to the triumph of architectural preservationists and historians over the forces of political expediency. It was a political tug-of-war of epic proportions, a story that is deserving of preservation of the Capitol itself. This is an account of people and vision for whom the Capitol building stands as a legacy of perseverance. Political maneuverings, cost miscalculations and overruns, and blatantly unauthorized deals slowed but did not thwart our success. The $70 million restoration of the California State Capitol was considered the largest in the Western world to date. It came during an era in which the United States was paying tribute to its 200th anniversary. California's Capitol restoration turned out to be one of the nation's most sublime bicentennial commemorations. Upon its completion, architectural critics with the Los Angeles Times, the San Francisco Chronicle, architectural journals called it a masterpiece. With more than 2 million visitors, and public approval came in an avalanche with more than 2 million persons touring the neoclassic Corinthian-style building in the year that it opened. But to understand how this magnificent building was nearly scuttled and how it could happen again, and is happening again, we need to go further into the past. After the magnitude 6.6 Sylmar earthquake of February 1971 threatened the San Fernando Valley of Los Angeles, state architect Fred Humble used a seismic report declaring that the Capitol was vulnerable to collapse in an earthquake. And I think Sacramento is probably the safest place to be during an earthquake. His report generated a legislative debate. Should the legislature abandon the building and construct a new Capitol, or should it restore and rehabilitate the old one for continued use? The state architect left the legislature a little time to ponder. He issued a condemnation order for the Capitol and directed the treasurer, lieutenant governor, and legislative staff to vacate the building. Senator Nicholas Petras, the point man on the Senate Rules Committee, and later chair of the Joint Rules Subcommittee on the Capitol Restoration Project, advocated in favor of a high degree of restoration. Good. He stood fast despite various restoration versus reconstruction controversies. However, as soon as the Joint Rules Committee decided on restoration, the Department of General Services Director Leonard Grimes hired John C. Worsley, the state architect for 2 years under Governor Ronald Reagan, to act as its surrogate owner's representative for the state architect without approval of the Joint Rules Committee membership. The state capitol might have been merely a reconstruction job with no more than shoring up crumbly and chalky brick to make the legislature safe against earthquakes if the Department of General Services had its way, and Worsley. Under Worsley's authority, unfortunately, many priceless and irreplaceable items that could have been restored were discarded. The appetite for replacing the Capitol had emerged far earlier, when Senator Randolph Collier unsuccessfully advocated in favor of a new state house. Collier continued promoting that idea into the 1970s. At his prodding, the legislature awarded $500,000 to Welton Beckett and Associates and Harry Devine joint venture architectural firms to weigh the problem. Not surprisingly, the Beckett-Devine 1975 report recommended construction of a new $500 million Capitol, with modest rehabilitation of the old Capitol for use as government offices or a museum. But a counterforce was emerging. In 1970, Governor Ronald Reagan appointed Raymond Gervigian, fellow American Institute of Architects, as the first historical architect to the State Historic Resources Commission. Gervigian, a former coordinator for the California Council of the American Institute of Architects, was the first who recommended restoration of the building for its continued use as a state capitol. Collier faced opposition from Senator James Mills of San Diego, who by 1971 was selected President pro tem of the Senate, and by virtue of that position, chairman of the Senate Rules Committee, which also lined up against Collier. Mills had been a curator of the Junipero Serra Museum before his legislative years and believed in architectural and historic legacy of the Capitol. Oh, wait a minute. On the other side, Assemblyman Willie Brown, chairman of the powerful Ways and Means Committee, introduced legislation favoring construction of a new capitol for Collier. Brown supported what the press dubbed Collier's Towers, a new capitol building consisting of two 17-story office buildings east of Capitol Park, separated by chambers at the base for the Assembly and Senate. But Brown's opponent for speakership, Leo McCarthy, favored retention of the Capitol. McCarthy won the post and appointed his own chairman to the Assembly Rules Committee, Leon Ralph, who in turn became chairman of the Joint Rules Committee. Unfortunately for the Senate, neither Ralph nor his staff was committed to following restoration guidelines as set out by the full committee vote. The legislature reappointed $42 million that April for restoring and rehabilitating the domed, century-old portion of the building, to which a modern annex, as you know, had been constructed by Earl Warren by 1948 and 1950. The legislative bill, AB 2071, Ralph specifically appointed an architect and contractor with experience in restoration and reconstruction of historic buildings. The gubernatorial election of 1974 also brought a new Democratic governor, Jerry Brown. Consequently, John Worsley, who was state architect under Reagan's last 2 years, lost his job to a Brown appointee, Sim van der Rin, but as I said earlier, Brown's new director of general services, Grimes, appointed Worsley to the project. This was despite the fact that the legislation and the architect's agreement stated that the legislature's owner's representative was the state architect. After that, a search for a prime contractor began. After screening 11 firms and considerable legal squabbles involving committee members and lawyers, the committee voted on a 6-4 vote for the joint venture of two firms, Heller, Continental, and Swinnerton Wahlberg. In October 1975, that consortium was commonly referred to as Heller. I must say that the Swinnerton and Wahlberg project superintendent, Chuck Kurtz, was an honorable man to work with. I observed and participated in much of the Byzantine process at close range. I was directed in my position to write another staff report for the committee members recommending the designation of Welton Beckett and Associates as the legislature's project architect, while Worsley acted as the owner's representative. The project still went to state architect Sim van der Rin to sign off on various phases of the project, which he did with 1 or 2 sentences. In a turnabout, Worsley now argued that his charge was only to make the old building seismically safe from possible earthquake damage, and if that meant gutting the interior brick walls, replacing them with concrete, and painting them white without ornamentation, then so be it. He repeated this several times, claiming insufficiency of funds for restoration. Worsley deviously had van der Rin sign off on the project by granting permission to the contract to gut the interior of the building without joint committee's approval. Heller acted as the general contractor on the structural phase of the project. The joint venture then acted as an administrative supervisor for obtaining other contractors. If this had been a normal private sector construction job, they would have been considered subcontractors. In February 1977, the restoration specialist who had wholly prepared Heller's presentation to the Joint Rules Committee was removed from the contractor's agreement after expressing alarm that the Capitol's original features might be replaced with copies. All references to his firm, Preservation Technology Group, were deleted. I wrote weekly reports to the Senate regarding progress of the project and raised concerns about violations that I saw involving bidding procedures and the Assembly's persistent repudiation of Gravillion's advocacy for restoration. In April 1976, Judge Joseph Babbage ruled against a suit by the Pacific Legal Foundation for an injunction against the Joint Rules Committee for various actions on the basis that the gutted Capitol was in a precarious position and that taxpayers would incur inflationary costs in the event of a delay. Much of the controversy arose over a made-up October Joint Rules Committee meeting in which members supposedly delegated certain powers to Chairman Ralph. However, his staff had to concede that no records or notes of such a meeting existed. Judge Babbage chided the Joint Rules Committee for handling the situation in the way that it did, saying that the legislative analyst A. Allen Post noted such conduct could lead to scandals. When he served in the cabinet of Earl Warren, the judge said, the former governor advised him, don't do things you don't want to read in tomorrow's newspaper. Soon after, Chairman Ralph really surprised his colleagues by abruptly announcing he would not run for re-election because he had a calling to become a preacher, which he did. However, his secretary, who used to work for me, disclosed that he was drinking heavily and was on edge with stress because of the restoration project. Perhaps that's why he wrote a memo to the contractor, architect, and DGS Director Grimes after I requested the original guaranteed maximum structural sum, independent estimates from his CAO, stating, to avoid duplicity, did he mean duplication? Capital restoration project materials should not be distributed to outsiders. Was I in the Senate outsiders? Because we didn't get it. Missing 10. Even though both the architect and contractor were chosen for their purported restoration experience, the architect's only experience was in the reconstruction of the Palace of Fine Arts designed by Bernard Maybeck for the Pan-Pacific Exposition in San Francisco in 1915. And the contractor's only experience with the historic building was to demolish the annex. To demolish the apse when they constructed the annex. Both relied heavily on preservation experts to get the job. As you know, Raymond Gravigian for Welton Beckett and Preservation Technology Group for Heller. Many restoration recommendations for this work rested with Gravigian, who still had to contest decisions made by Worsley, who in effect assumed the preservation mantle of the Preservation Technology Group. In many instances, Heller hired some of his old subcontractors to do the work of restoration experts. This belied the early rationale for exempting the contracts from the State Contract Act. It was argued earlier that exemptions had to take place because artisans were needed for such work and that they could be underbid by contractors using schlocky materials or doing inferior work. Eventually, however, due to the fights between participants, the Senate and the legislative analyst successfully recommended implementation of pre-qualified bidding procedures because of the distrust engendered by Worsley. Despite that, such recommendations were ignored at times. Some Senate members expressed concern that the historical integrity of the Capitol could be compromised if arguments among the architects, contractor, and state officials ended with a decision to, quote, fabricate copies of original materials, unquote. Their concern was justified when the contractor dismissed Preservation Technology Group in February 1977. Much of the resultant work, unfortunately, did not meet the standards that preservationists expected. Here are 6 out of 16 examples of the shortcomings. Cast iron work. Instead of using a zinc primer and glass bead peening, as PTG recommended, the contractor sandblasted the cast iron and used a different primer recommended by Worsley, which caused problems. The restoration had been estimated at $300,000, but jumped to $900,000 before the project was completed, finally by going back and using the organic zinc primer. Second, doors. Most doors underwent cleaning using a caustic acid solution without consulting the Preservation Technology Group. It damaged the glue parts and made them unusable, according to Worsley. The Sacramento specialist mill, Burnett and Sons, won a bid to make the doors for $800 each. As a result, doors were replicated, not restored. Burnett went on to making baseboards, replicating furniture for Governor George Pardee's museum office, and best of all, replicating missing monumental staircases for the Assembly and the Senate originally created by his grandfather. Third, hardware. The contractor asked Schlage Door Lock and Hardware Company to do research and development to restore antique escutcheon door plates and hinges for the doors, which the company initially offered to do for free. After its sample work was rejected many times, Schlage asked for $8,000 to continue research and development work. Gravigian recommended other firms to develop samples, but was rebuffed despite Senate protests. The finished project did not compare to the high-quality work of a San Francisco firm called Searcast, which specialized in casting ornamental, rich Victorian pieces from 1870 to 1950, the period the Capitol Restoration wanted and should have emulated. The Schlage Schlegel reproductions lacked the extremely fine detail that Ciercast used in its lost wax method of casting. Ornamental relief. Lena Tyler of Los Angeles had a 19th century firm that recommended by Gravigian as a consultant to development ornamental ceiling with a historic process called compo, a Versailles palace composition of horse glue and hair with plaster of Paris. Although she designed the patterns, the contractor curtailed his plan to produce ornamental ceilings and friezes in 15 rooms, instead only making 7 and only 1 wall frieze. Marble mosaic tile. The second floor corridor tile had to be removed when the building was gutted. The contractor subsequently offered 3 bids per the newly developed procedures, but only 1 was for restoration, and the other 2 replication. The restoration, $395,000. The 2 replication, $200,000. After heated arguments protesting the apples and oranges style of obtaining bids, Worsley and Heller finally permitted Gravigian to seek 2 additional restoration bids, one from Universal Marble of Los Angeles for approximately $185. That's way down. And Hans Scharf for $155,000. Fortunately, Scharf's work became the outstanding example of restoration in the capital and was widely acclaimed, even by Heller. 6, encaustic tile. The first floor corridor ceramic tile contained 4 murals of Eureka, the state seal of California, which were removed because Worsley claimed the so-called non-disclosed test indicated that they only had 35 years of life left, which is a... He took over research and development responsibilities for this project from Preservation Technology. Instead of using the original patents to recreate the tile work, he commissioned an Orange County firm to silk screen the designs on blank tile instead of the traditional method of baking clays into the bisque from 1/8 to 1/4 inch deep, embedded in the tile, similar to cloisonné. Although Gravigian recommended other firms, Worsley stuck with an Orange County firm for research and development. A Sausalito firm eventually made the tile with stainless steel screens. No other firm offered to bid on such an unknown, untried process. This tile had its design sprayed on, similar to a silk screen method, followed by the baking the image. Then a second baking took place, put glaze over the tile. It remains to be seen if this glaze will last for the life of the original encaustic tile. Despite numerous political fights, work on the project neared completion in January 1982, but not before another disappointment emerged before the public unveiling. The Capitol Historical Furnishings project under Gravigian had intended to install authentic, period-appropriate decor for a few principal rooms used by the legislative officers, portions of the legislative chambers, and a few conference and hearing rooms. Selection of interior furnishings was supposed to have been bid out to an expert consultant, but somehow the project architect ordered commercial reproduction furnishings of the federal period. Senate Executive Officer John Williamson and I argued that such furnishings were of a style too early for the Capitol, which was constructed in 1860 to 1871. We believe the restored offices should have original antiques of the period. Joint Rules Committee Chair Louis Papin, who replaced Leon Ralph January 5th, 1977, fired me, and soon after had Welton Beckett drop Gervigian from the project while Senator Petrus was on a trip in Greece. On his return, Petrus blasted Papin in a June 1977 letter. Quote, "Your intractable position on refusing to continue the services of historical restoration architect Gervigian in connection with the Capitol Museum project and the Historical Furnishings project. Once again, you took advantage of me and broke your word. These intimidating tactics remind me of the way Worsley repeatedly attempted to bully Gervigian time after time to pressure him away from his restoration positions, especially after you managed to remove Dan Visnich from the scene, leaving Gervigian single-handed to defend himself in his efforts to serve the high standards of restoration that the Senate desired. It's a wonder that he did succeed in spite of the revolting pressures and questionable practices that Worsley and his henchmen used behind his back. We do still need him for the unfinished museum historical furnishings project, which Gervigian conceived, guided to realization, and was in the process of trying to conclude when you so unceremoniously suddenly terminated him." Unquote. After that broadside, the Senate Rules Committee unanimously voted to designate Visnich as its owner's representative on the project and retain Gervigian to continue his responsibilities. Gradually, the Senate view prevailed with others, and the project team began heeding Gervigian's advice. By the middle of 1980, the furnishings team began to acquire traditional reproduction furniture for the outer offices, and the Senate, meanwhile, gave Gervigian and me and the staff of three another hat, authority to furnish the leadership offices and committee rooms using antiques, using that reproduction budget that they had for the earlier. Gervigian criteria required furniture be from the building's earlier period, roughly 1870 to 1910, and largely of the American Renaissance style, which his research revealed was used by the original builders. Our first priority was to return original pieces to the Capitol with the help of the state Supreme Court Justice Rose Bird, under the auspices of an 8-member judicial committee on the Capitol Restoration Project. We searched and found numerous antiques in various state offices, particularly among the Supreme Court and the Courts of Appeal. But most of the authentic period pieces we purchased from California antique dealers, and then we had some donations. The program proved so successful and economical that additional antiques were bought for other areas of the Capitol. Ironically, antiques were less costly than the reproductions and have since increased in value, while the inappropriate federal reproduction pieces have declined in value. I succeeded in obtaining San Francisco sculptor Spero Anarchis to replicate the missing Native American equestrian acroteria statuary located on the west front pediment. Originally created by California's first sculptor, Pietro Mazzara. Indian warrior being attacked by a bear, and Indian woman being attacked by a buffalo. And those were inspired by artists George Catlin and John McStanley during the 1830s and 1840s, respectively. Wonderful paintings. And Argus also created the Union Greeps for the Senate and Assembly porticos. Despite these architectural and political disputes, the project's overall effect was masterful. An eloquent restoration that captured the gaslight era with glowing wall sconces, decorative plaster friezes, ornate coffered ceilings in the chambers, and carved monumental staircases in the Renaissance Revival style. In the end, a reasonable degree of restoration was obtained, especially with the magnificent marble mosaic tile and that staircase that Burnett Miller did. The project incorporated an additional enhancement, turning a few key historical rooms originally used by constitutional officers into a state capitol museum. More than 1 million people toured those museums, those rooms, in the months after unveiling the restoration in 1982. One particularly ugly aspect of the restoration project involved the guaranteed maximum structural sum. The project went from bad to worse to worsely. Negotiations about the structural sum between Mike Heller and Worsley began September 21st, 1976, in the contractor's office at 555 Capitol Mall. This was the first time the project meeting met outside the restoration project office. Contractor Mike Heller angrily ordered me not to take notes about the structural estimates during the negotiations. I replied that I didn't work for him. I worked for the Senate. I'm losing my place here. Worsley began deliberations, asserting that the structural rehabilitation would cost $9 million. He declared that was the estimate submitted by Gosseliner McLean, an independent estimator that he retained to help him negotiate the contract for the structural renovation work. Heller claimed that the work would cost $17 million. While the group walked back to the Capitol, I asked Worsley for documentation of the Gosseliner $9 million estimate, to which he agreed. However, he failed to provide it. Then on September 24th, 3 days later, without the project team attending, Worsley and Heller agreed upon the guaranteed maximum structural sum at $15 million. 2 weeks after the agreement, without submitting it to the full Joint Rules Committee, Worsley had the State Public Works Board approve the sum. Gosseliner McLean later adjusted their estimate from $9 million up to $14.4 million. When I asked Worsley for the original Gosseliner $9 million estimate so that I could present it to John Williamson, Executive Officer of the Senate Rules Committee, he initially resisted. He asserted that the independent estimator, Gosseliner McLean, lacked sufficient information about the process. Despite acknowledging that the estimates and renovation project details are within the realm of public information, he warned me and Williamson against contacting the press. He feared public criticism, not for himself, but for the project. The Senate Rules Committee held a closed hearing after my Senate memorandum regarding the structure sum was made public, and the contractor criticized it. I rebutted the contractor's claim in a Senate Rules Committee closed hearing. Later in August 1977, pursuant to Senate Rules Resolution 451, the Auditor General and the legislative analyst issued a 58-page examination of the Capitol Restoration Project. It justified my memos. I was vindicated by the legislative analyst and the Auditor General's report that corroborated my findings and earned front-page banner headlines in the Los Angeles Times and the Sacramento Union in August 1977. Their review revealed, quote, management deficiencies and questionable judgment, and that decisions have been made by the team and/or the owner's representative, which more properly are the responsibility of the Joint Rules Committee. The report further declared, the Joint Rules Committee as a committee should actively participate in the project. The auditor analyst report stated with emphasis, the Gosseliner-McLean representative stated they did not meet with the contractor prior to the submission of the $14.4 million estimate. Worsley claimed the $9 million estimate was used in contesting the contractor. It was incomplete. So why did he give it to the contractor? It was a $4 million to $6 million windfall for the contractor because Worsley let the contractor gut the interior walls and floors of the Capitol. Several years later, after completion of the restoration project, an informant close to my attorney, Nathaniel Cawley, disclosed Worsley had purchased a condominium at Lake Tahoe that was notarized September 24th, 1976 by Frank Compoy, a state insurance agent in Sacramento. Was that a coincidence? I'm left with the impression it was merely fortuitous. During that year, some 30 condos at Tahoma constituted the last construction project at Lake Tahoe before a moratorium set in at that time. The condo complex was completed at the border of El Dorado County. Across the borderline of Placer County was the home and boathouse said to be owned by Michael Heller. It may have been owned by Cecil Mark, Heller's partner, who was also president of the Associated General Contractors of California at that time. A twist of fate? Got me. Both Senator Mills and Petrus repeatedly said that Worsley did not represent the legislature. He represented the contractor. As for me, I had the honor of working for Nicholas Petrus and James Mills, and I pay tribute to them for fighting for a fairly decent restoration that could have even been better. You might think that I've gone too far in revealing problems. I didn't even mention the money made by the contractor in many costly change orders. But consider Article 9 of the Historic State Capitol Commission law. The commission shall maintain and may utilize all historic data, research, project files developed and gathered by the state in connection with the California Capitol Restoration Project. On that date, the commission commences business, All of the written materials covered under this section shall be transferred to the state archives to inventory, process, and store on behalf of the commission. Contrary to law, it took 12 to 14 years for those project materials to be transferred from the contractor warehouse to the assembly warehouse. And while Worsley's assistant, Dale Dwyer, was paid by the Joint Rules Committee to cleanse them before sending them to archives for commission use. No project meeting tapes are maintained by archives. Ray Gavigan endured years of harassment from multiple fronts and confronted barriers every step of the way. But he persevered, and California is the beneficiary of his dedication to historic preservation and accuracy. The American Institute of Architects justifiably honored Ray with a national award for his work on the Capitol Restoration Project. Ultimately, the Assembly introduced a resolution designating him Historic Architect Emeritus of California State Capitol. Ironically, Assemblyman Willie Brown ended up occupying the Speaker's northeast corner office on the second floor. Brown was surprised and delighted that the restoration turned out so well and that he was moving into such a magnificent office with this Renaissance revival furniture, antique furnishings. When I escorted him to his office, I told him he had an office to match that of the governor. No, Dan, far better. Winning the speakership and gaining his ornate office elated Willie. He didn't seem to care that the Collier concept went up in smoke. Willie later became mayor of San Francisco and at the same time, a born-again preservationist. He saw to it that his city hall was magnificently restored. And I'd like to add a postscript. That's the end of my thing. With luck and perseverance, we saved the Capitol in 1976 from the terrible fate Senator Collier had long sought, but barely. Now we're facing the same fight, and at this time, we have not been so lucky. The East Annex is already gone, likely to be replaced by a mirrored glass cube that will have all the dignity of a gambling casino and kill many, many, many birds. And the legislature is threatening to tear out this historic plaza where Californians have gathered for decades in groups and marches to express their views on contentious issues. We must rally again to the defense of tradition, history, and save the beauty of the Capitol. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
So this is the current project.
One more thing.
Did people get to see pictures?
Yeah, so we're gonna do the current project now. Go ahead. So Dan has asked that we play a clip from what's
Yes.
happening at the current project so that you can see the process in real time and give a real modernized view of what's happening behind, correct? The fences.
Correct.
I'm going to talk briefly about the historic resources that are going to be lost with this project. And biggest issue is the demolition of the historic annex building. It's a building that is on the National Register, designed by Alfred Eichler, who's one of Sacramento's most prominent mid-century modern architects, who designed the building extremely carefully to be clearly different from, but blend with our beautiful restored original state capitol. There was never an environmental analysis of keeping the building. There was only a decision very early on that it had to be demolished. The annex project then morphed into a much larger project that includes also a new 200-car underground parking garage that includes a new visitor center. It will be in the basement of that building with its entrance at the front west most prominent and most important facade of our restored capitol. It involves excavating the entire area that's now known as the West Plaza. And the excavation would be the width of those very broad front capitol steps that are known as the West Steps. So you would now, instead of looking at the ground level capitol as we see it now with its steps going up to its beautiful main entrance, you would be looking at this slanting cement wide walkway going down, and then a huge bank of glass doors. The entrance to the Capitol would be covered by a porch-like area that extends over it and completely changes the appearance of the Capitol. That's the area where so many demonstrations, celebrations have taken place literally over generations. This is also a National Register building. It could lose its listing over this. This is why we're fighting our fight. Thank you.
Okay.
You gotta write your legislator, folks.
So Dan, do you have a few moments to take a few questions from the
Yes.
audience? So, do we have any questions from the audience tonight?
Thank you. Dan, the annex had several features to it that were really important. Some of the, if I recall, on the outside there were some Art Deco features around it. But I remember specifically inside on the fourth floor hearing rooms, there were the murals in each hearing room, the Senate and
Yeah.
the Assembly. What happened to those, and what's going to happen to them?
They're probably in storage, and I originally got them when I was looking for antiques in Los Angeles. And they were destroying the building there, and they had them stored. So I got them for the fourth floor. But I imagine that they have taken them out and perhaps maybe have them stored with the Crocker Art Museum. I'm not sure. But I got something like $28 million worth of paintings for the Capitol. And as you know, I don't really trust the legislature that much. So we had this nonprofit to have them because people were giving away the paintings once they were contributed to the Capitol. And now that I'm so old, Burnett Miller was the chair of our nonprofit after John Moss, and he decided that what we should do is donate them to the Crocker Art Museum to take care for the Capitol Commission. And so once a year, they will go by and make sure that the paintings are okay. But they are now owned by the Crocker Art Museum, not the legislature.
And they're not going to be installed, I presume, reinstalled?
They'll be re-put back in the Capitol, yeah.
They will be?
Yeah,
Okay,
with the Crocker Art Museum checking on them.
okay.
Another question? You have to give me a moment to get over there.
Dan, could you share a little bit about the meeting with Governor Jerry Brown when he was
yes.
newly elected and Mr. Ray Gervigian?
Yeah, I thought I had that in my speech, but apparently I printed the wrong version. When all this was happening and they didn't know what was going to happen, when Governor Brown came in, he called Gervigian into his office to find out whether the Capitol should be restored. And Gervigian was tight on time, and he asked him, should the Capitol be restored? And he spent 40 minutes with the governor telling him why. And after that, he said, I gotta go. I'm gonna miss my plane. So Governor Brown had the CHP take him to the airport with the sirens blasting to make his plane.
What was the result afterwards?
Well, the result was that Brown approved, publicly came out for the restoration. Yeah. I thought I mentioned that, I'm sorry.
Any other questions? Dan, can you tell the story about what happened to the beautiful windows at the Capitol?
Yes.
This is my favorite one.
The last thing that was constructed for the Capitol were magnificent paned, hand-rolled glass windows that were made in Brussels, and they were shipped around the Horn. And I don't know whether you know it, but when they made glass, you couldn't get windows that big at that time because people blew the glass out and it came out in a cylinder, and then you cut the cylinder down and spread it out like that, and it became a window. But as a result of that, you had various distortions looking out the window, which I thought were beautiful. And I asked John Worsley, he said he threw them away. What? I can't believe it. And then he had the contractor put in other windows, and they were colored, and then they took them out and they put in other windows. That's the way the project went, It was a shame because those windows were absolutely magnificent. And they really added aura to the Capitol.
Hi. The parking structure reference that's under construction, how many levels was that underneath the Capitol?
I'm not sure, but to me, it's absolutely crazy to invade State Capitol Park and tear down all those trees when they should just use the basement as they always did for parking.
Right.
I don't know what's going on. When I was in the legislature, you had 8 preservationist legislators, and you had all kind of people supporting that. There's not one in the legislature now that supports preservation.
Terrible.
And I'm talking about Republicans and Democrats.
I know this, it was presented to us about 4 or 5 years ago about this proposal to do the parking structure. And I always wondered, why didn't they dig west? They have this whole Capitol Avenue they could have dug under and not disturb the structure or underneath the Capitol.
You're right.
Was that ever presented?
I wrote letters, not only for me, but for the former State Historic Preservation Officer, for Senator James Mills, and for Senator Alan Cerroti, asking them to adhere to the original law presented by Willie Brown. First, it was vetoed when Senator Petrus had it, so he gave it to Willie for the Historic State Capitol Commission. And anything done in that building was supposed to have been reviewed by them. And I wrote that to the chairman of the Joint Rules Committee. He totally ignored it. I wrote a second letter showing him the Department of Interior standards, what they were and what they should be following. And he ignored that too. Everything that they have done has been, I can't say blissful ignorance, just outrageous. Just, it's a shame. There's a question over here.
Yes, Dan, thinking of the future, with California's significant budget shortfall, and we hear in the press that the governor's having to cut left and right to balance the budget, do you have any insight into the, maybe I'm being hopeful, but I'm wondering if a cost saving that could be realized would be, of course, not disturbing the west face, not building that nonsensical portico and the unbelievable underground garage and all that idiocy, and saving the multiple millions that leaving it alone in its historic state would preserve. Is there any sense that that might happen?
I think you answered your own question. I doubt it. I really, really doubt it. They have not followed, they haven't followed laws. And when the Court of Appeals ruled against them twice, yesterday, what did they do? Introduce a legislation to do away with the CEQA on them. They make laws for other people that they don't want to follow themselves? That's not right.
Thank you.
Okay, I have a few more questions popping up.
Just a quick question. Is there an alternative proposal or location for the entrance to this visitor center? Is there something else that we can point to and say, this is a more viable alternative without destroying our West End?
They could put it on the sides if they want to, which people have recommended. Mine is to have it in the rear of the Capitol, where the students could have the buses, because they go to Capitol Park and they get lectures. So why not begin with that? But they don't want it. Why? They want that visitor center there, so nobody will bother them in their offices. They don't want the kids coming in there, and that's why they designed it the way that they did. Yes.
Well, hi, Dan. Let me just say this. I've known Dan for 12 years. We've worked together on the Nathaniel Colley films and videos, but this other part of your life that you spent so many decades on, this Capitol Restoration Project, Dan is also a fantastic archivist and documentarian. Dan has saved 120 boxes of this history that he's been talking about. It's all at the Center for Sacramento History. And so my question to you is, what's this been like here the last couple of years, or the last few months even, as you've been preparing for this talk, going back through all of your own material that you saved all those years ago and sort of reliving this history? What's that been like?
That's interesting that you asked that, because then I brought one of the books that I gave the Historic State Capitol Commission at that time on John Worsley. And I noticed that one of the things that was at the end here, let me see. Continental Heller organization, the thing they gave the Capitol and everything, and they indicated let me see. Oh, here it is. They ended the presentation. Preservation and restoration functions will acquire the application of the highest standards of skill, experience, and craftsmanship. I'm afraid we didn't see it from them.
Let me, if I also could, please give a shout out to my own videographer and drone operator, Steve Davis.
Yes.
Steve is the one who captured all the drone video. Steve has been for 3 years documenting the current demolition and what's been going on there at the state capitol, and has compiled over 200 hours of material, and is going to keep at it, right? Yeah. Because this really is sort of history, you know. Dan, what's your best guess when this is all said and done? What's your best guess as to what the west side of the state capitol is going to look like?
Hell. Since they are ignoring the 3rd District Court of Appeals, trying to save the Capitol, they're doing what they're doing, which is sheer nonsense. There, I think, is a problem when you get such a heavy-weighted. I'm a Democrat. I used to be staff director of the Senate Democratic Caucus, helped getting people elected and everything. But I have to tell you, I'm really against the heavy-weighted Democratic legislature, because now you see what happens. They don't care what happens to the Capitol. The citizens of Sacramento should really care. I mean, it's their home plate. This is the entrance to our city, and it should be nice. It shouldn't be spoiled like they're doing. And they're doing it disobeying all the laws that legislators should be following. Finished? Well, I'd like to tell you that I'm 91, and I hope I gave Joe Biden competition of standing this long.
May I have your attention, please, real fast? I just need to make an announcement. I know this evening there were a few people who paid $10 because they're not members. They paid to attend this program. July and August, we suspend our programs. We do